lots of atrocities happen in warfare. The battle in Kursk has been particularly ugly and has aroused a great deal of anger on the Russian side. I think, however, in Ukraine, the Russian military, for the most part, has been careful to treat Ukrainian prisoners pretty well in order to encourage defection. Here, I think this is a credible statement by Vladimir Putin. I'm glad President Trump called for mercy for the defeated Ukrainian military in Kursk, and I hope they get it.
Go ahead.
Well, as I understand it, this was the creme de la creme of the Ukrainian military, or such as it was left after months of war. And so I suspect if it was that, they were fighting to the bitter death. But all along the line, I've heard that Putin has put out the word, the generals have followed that word, that it's very advantageous to Russia to get as many Ukrainians to surrender as they can. So the policy, as I understand it, is if you surrender and you make it known that you're surrendering, you'll be taken into custody and you'll be treated fairly well. That's a great propaganda technique and a great victory technique, because you bleed the enemy of its soldiers rather rapidly. Works probably a lot better along the main line of contact, where there are a lot of people who shouldn't be there in the first place, little training and so forth. But this group was pretty hardcore. And Putin's statement to me is a reasonable response to Trump's sort of cri de coeur for, passion and or not for passion, but for compassion.
I think it's going to be easy to implement. The Russian tradition is not one of kindness to invaders, and this is on Russian territory. Certainly the Soviet Union's army, the Red Army, was not very kind to the Germans whom it captured, or for that matter, to those Russians or other Soviet citizens who were captured by the Germans. And furthermore, the Geneva Conventions, which provide standards for the treatment of captured enemy soldiers, surrendered enemy soldiers, were pretty much done away with by us in Afghanistan, with the invention of the concept of the enemy combatant not being entitled to the dignified treatment that Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin have called for. So I think we'll have to keep our fingers crossed. But one thing is clear, and that is the Ukrainian armed forces who invaded Kursk, as Larry said, were the very best equipped, very best trained, best motivated that Ukraine had, are being utterly annihilated.
Let me add one thing to that, Nima. I want to reinforce what the ambassador said about our having abandoned essentially all the work that we did from the Nuremberg trials in particular, all the way up to the time of 9/11, when my president, George W. Bush, was faced with a fairly well-explained choice. On the one hand, by Donald Rumsfeld and the Vice President Dick Cheney, and on the other hand, by Colin Powell, and to a lesser extent, Dr. Rice, the National Security Advisor, and eloquently by Powell's lawyer at the time, William Howard Taft IV, a famous name in American politics, and also former Undersecretary, or actually Deputy Secretary of Defense. So he knew what he was talking about with regard to the Geneva Conventions. And we left him. We made a calculated decision right there on the spot to abandon essentially all the things we'd done since Nuremberg. And we had been the craftsmen, more or less, of that. And I don't think we've returned to it since, really.
No. It's actually, this is actually a very good illustration of why you should always consider what if the worst happens to you when you consider doing the worst to someone else.
Yep. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is not a bad piece of advice for military operations.
Exactly.
When it comes to the first round of negotiations between the Americans, between the Trump team and Ukrainians, and which came out to be a ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Ambassador, how did you find the way that Vladimir Putin tried to respond to this proposal on the part of Trump? Here is what they put on the social media. You see the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Emmanuel Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, and Kaja Kallas. They all put that the ball is now in Russia's court. And Russia has responded to what they were asking for. How did you find the response of Vladimir Putin?
Well, let me say at first that this is not a ceasefire between Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin, or between Ukraine and Russia. It's a ceasefire between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky. That is to say, Zelensky agreed finally, after refusing for years to negotiate. He agreed technically to negotiate with the Russians. And the price of that was a resumption of military aid and intelligence support on our side. And I think Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump are in analogous positions. Neither wants to offend the other. Both see that the big prize is a broad rapprochement between Russia and the United States, which would benefit both countries. It's a much larger issue than Ukraine. Both undoubtedly would like to bring the war to a close in a peaceful manner. And so Mr. Putin has basically finessed the issue. He has remained true to the objectives he set at the outset in December 2021. He wants a peace, not a ceasefire. He will accept a ceasefire as part of a broader peace agreement. That peace agreement has to address the issue of Ukrainian neutrality and no presence of hostile forces, foreign forces on Ukrainian soil aimed at Russia, no NATO in Ukraine. And it has to deal with the broader issue of security architecture in Europe that can reassure both the Russians and other Europeans against the threats that each perceives from the other. And of course, he also wants to protect the Russian speakers in Ukraine, most of whom he now controls in the 4 oblasts that he has occupied in whole or in part.